China has for decades committed atrocities against Tibetans and have uprooted the Tibetan people from their own land. Tibetans have long faced countless enforced imprisonments, custodial deaths, relocation of nomads, destruction of several cultural sites and monasteries, extensive CCTV monitoring and separation of children from their families under the name of re-education to assimilate their cultural identity. Beijing claims sovereignty over Tibet, while Tibet insists that it has always been an individual entity, separate from China. Join us as we take a closer look at the underlying history of the China-Tibet conflict and see how the international community needs to do more to recognize an independent Tibet.
Expressing their anger and resentment against Beijing's atrocities continually committed against Tibetans. These activists from the Tibetan Youth Congress and the National Democratic Party of Tibet opposed Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gong's visit to India during the G20 summit in New Delhi. The Tibetan activists demanded that the G20 nations protect Tibetan children who have been forced into colonial boarding by Beijing. According to a recent report by the United Nations, roughly 1 million Tibetan minority children in China have been separated from their families and placed into government-run boarding schools. They are forced to complete a compulsory education curriculum in the Mandarin Chinese language, with no access to their traditional or their culturally relevant learning. The UN report also noted that these government schools do not provide for substantive study of Tibetan language, history, and culture.
If you look at the recent kind of policy, the colonial boarding school, which is the new policy introduced by the CPC to brainwash a very young, innocent Tibetan student, especially the children. At the very young age of 5, they were forced to attend the Chinese colonial school, that too a boarding school.
Beijing opposes any political and spiritual activities of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Living in exile in India, the Dalai Lama continues to work to protect the rights of the Tibetan people. While imparting his preaching in Bodh Gaya recently, the Dalai Lama criticized China for its disastrous and unsuccessful attempts to destroy Buddhism in Tibet.
System that is trying to seize the Dharma as like a poison and try to destroy it, completely, but they are not successful. And so, instead of that, there is newfound interest in the Dharma in China.
Despite Beijing's resistance and best attempts, the world is gradually beginning to recognize the Tibetan cause, and there is increasing pressure on Beijing to safeguard the sovereign rights of the Tibetan people. The U.S. Congress, in its Tibetan Policy and Support Act of 2019, passed a bill asking the Department of State not to authorize any new Chinese consulates in the United States until a U.S. consulate had been established in Lhasa, Tibet. Congress also reauthorized the Office of the U.S. Special Coordinator for Tibetan Issues to ensure that the next Dalai Lama will be appointed solely by the Tibetan Buddhist faith community. The bill also requires the State Department to discuss U.S. efforts to promote the human rights of the Tibetan people. Beijing is desperate, however, to keep its stranglehold on Tibet due to its geographically strategic importance. As Beijing aggressively pursues its One China policy, the repression in Tibet is expected to intensify. The emerging threat to Tibetan identity, cultural and religious beliefs immediately requires the world's urgent attention.